Hello, friends. This is Doug Schaible, and welcome again to the Premature Bible Institute. Just thank you once again for continuing on with these lessons. We've gone quite a ways so far. It's pretty amazing how much material we covered. And as a matter of fact, in today's lesson, what we're going to do is take time, stop for a second, and just review. With the last lesson, we've really finished up the book of Genesis. And so what we want to do is just go back and take stock of some of the things that we've actually learned and grasped so far. And we just want to, the book of Genesis, of course, means the beginnings. It's the beginning of everything. Not the beginning of God, because he was eternal, always was there. But he began everything. So there are just all kinds of things that we talk about: the history, the beginning of the world, the universe, animals, people, languages, oceans, land, plants, sin, religion, species, Israel, all kinds of things that are the beginnings of. And it's a historical record that God wants us to know so that we can see how he is the sovereign. He is the one who started all of this, but it reveals something about himself at the same time. And he wants us to know that, and he wanted to share who he was with something else, and so he created people in the long run. So this, like I said, finishes Genesis, and now we're going to move on to Exodus and some other things. Now, like I said before, we're not going to be teaching the whole Old Testament, but these early stages are very, very important because they're the foundation. They're the beginnings of everything, and they lay the foundations for things to come later on. So the book of Genesis was written by Moses, as we know it, and Moses was the one who wrote all of these things down and had a historical record of that. Now, I know a lot of people will say that there were no writings before Moses, or people were oral cultures. They didn't have things with writing, and I personally, I don't agree with that. I think that there's no indication that people couldn't write right from the very beginning. Just because we don't have a record of it doesn't mean they couldn't do it. And logically speaking, people would need to have things to write. If they were building cities or towns or whatever it is they're doing, they have to give instructions to people, and to assume that everybody's going to remember the right thing every time is, I think, naive to me. So I think that there were writings. And Moses, what he's doing is he's compiling all of this, putting it into the book, the first 5 books of the Bible, which we call the Pentateuch. And he wrote these things down. So let's go back here and learn, just think through a few things. The first thing we learned was that God was in eternity past. So God was there. He was always there. He was there before everything else. And if he was there before everything else, then by nature he could not have had a beginning. God existed eternally. He was always there. Now, for us as humans, as finite beings, we can't understand. I don't think we can understand that God's eternal, but the scope of that, I don't think we understand. How does the finite comprehend eternity? They can't. It's just because we're limited in our understanding, and eternity by nature is unlimited. So we couldn't understand it. We just agree with it, that's what he said, that God was there in eternity past, dwelling with himself, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, these 3 persons in one God. It's not like 3 separate parts of God. They each were God, but they were each one. And that's kind of the interesting thing about it. I don't understand that. I don't comprehend that. I just know it to be true because God says it's true. And he's referring to himself, and he's talking about himself in so many ways. So, but somewhere along the line, he decides he's going to create. Now, like I said before, with the creation of the spirit world, we're not exactly sure when that might have happened. I personally think it happened before everything else was created, because of some passages in Job where it says that the sons of God shouted for joy when they saw God laying the foundations of the earth. So God was there. He was in eternity past, and he starts to create, and he creates this spirit world. Now, where it's at, I'm not really concerned about right at the moment. The main idea is that he did create a spirit world. Angels, archangels, cherubim, seraphim, and all of these angelic beings have responsibilities and privileges that are given to them. And they were to worship and serve their Creator, do what he wanted them to do. But he was never asking them to do anything that was not good or perfect or whatever. He just wanted them to do that. So he creates a spirit world. There's a number you can't even imagine. We don't even know how many. It was just so many. and he gave him great wisdom and power. And we know of one of those that he named was Lucifer, and Lucifer was the anointed cherub who covers, it says. So he was something special. There was something unique about him as opposed to all the other spirit beings that were there. But for whatever reason, this spirit being decides that wasn't good enough for him, just to be his second in command. It says that he wanted to be like the Most High, and so he decided that he was going to rebel against his Creator and get as many as could to go with him, and out of it, it just doesn't even make sense, but he decides he's going to overthrow his Creator and take the role of Godhead. And that was just kind of silly in that thinking, but that's what he did. So God creates a spirit world, creates all of the angels, all of the spirits, and there's one, and then eventually he rebels against God and takes a third of those angels with him that decided to follow him. And his name is changed to Satan, which means adversary or enemy. And so his job now, I shouldn't say his job, but what he does now is actively tries to oppose God in every way, shape, and form that he can. And so what he does is he tries to ruin what God wants to do, try and interfere with his plan. But as we'll see throughout history, he always loses. It isn't that he loses every battle. It's just he's going to lose the battle. And God does what he does. But even when Satan appears to win, God still wins through it, and because he knows everything there is to know. And that's another aspect of God. God knows everything that there is to know. God is eternal. He's omnipotent. He can do anything he wants to do. But whatever he does will always be consistent with who he is. He is who he is, and he's not anything else. He cannot lie, and he's everywhere at the same time. There isn't any place that he isn't. Like that girl said, God is so big that he doesn't have to go anywhere. So Satan rebels against God, but then God goes to create the physical world. And so he creates on day 1 the light, day 2 the firmament, day 3 the dry land appears and the vegetation, day 4 the sun, the moon, the stars, day 5 the fish and the birds, day 6 the land animals, Adam and Eve, the garden, they're in the garden. Everything couldn't be better. It's just an amazing thing. So he creates Adam and Eve, takes dust of the dirt of the ground, forms them into a shape of a man, and says, breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. And then he becomes a living soul. And then eventually God says, it's not good for man to be alone. So he creates a woman, and he creates this woman to be a companion and a helper. And they both work together to manage and rule the earth as God told them that they should do. They had 2 commands in the beginning. They were to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In other words, have a lot of children, raise the earth, and fill the earth with them, and manage the earth. And then that they were to have dominion over everything that's created, the dominion over the fish and the birds, the land, everything. So man was to rule the earth, not the other way around. The earth was not to rule man. And so the earth, they would bring it under subjection, it said. So what that meant is not that it was wild and does things on its own. It's just that everything was so perfect that everything grew probably at astronomical rates, all the corn and wheat and whatever. And so all the animals were to be, they were brought to Adam, and he named them all and started naming them. And I'm sure Adam and Eve, their job was to categorize all this, put these animals over here, and all these different things, not because they would fight with each other, because they wouldn't, but because they had different needs, different types of grass or vegetation that they had to eat, and so on. So, and then God put them in this garden. But before he created Eve, remember what he told Adam? He says, here's what I want to tell you. He says, you can eat from every tree in the garden. Every tree in this garden is going to be good for you. It's going to be good for food. It's going to be pleasant to look at, and so on. And you can eat from any tree in the garden, even the tree of life. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you're not to eat from that, because in the day that you eat of it, you'll die. And so Adam, okay, that's fine. And so everything was fine. Then he created Eve. Eve was brought to the man, and they were doing everything as good as can be done, as a husband and wife can do it. They never argued. They got along together. They got along with all the animals, all their surroundings. Everything was working together, and they were just having a good time. And the man and the woman were managing all that. But then there came a point where the serpent, it says, Satan came to Eve in the form of a serpent, and he deceived her. He tricked her into thinking that she needed something that she already had, actually. She had wisdom, she had beauty, she had knowledge. And those were the three things that Satan offered to her. And she says, okay, that sounds good. And she eats this fruit. She gives to her husband, and he eats. And he says, and both of their eyes were open. And he says, and they knew that they were naked. And so now this is a real mess. They're trying to, first thing he did was they tried to make clothing from a God who to cover themselves from a God who can see everything. And then the second thing they tried to do was hide in the garden from a God who's everywhere. And then they tried to lie to a God who knows everything there is to know. And so this is what was going on. And so as a result of this, not only did Adam and Eve suffer the consequences, but everything around them did. All the animals, all of creation suffered as a result of that. And remember what I've said before, that sin never affects just the person who did the sin. It affects everyone around them. And in the same way, righteousness, like I said with Joseph, righteousness affects everyone around them too. It isn't that everybody becomes righteous. It's just that righteousness is a good way of living just in itself, in and of itself, and it affects other people. Like the scripture says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. People hate sinners. They hate people that sin continually. All we have to do is watch TV on any of the news networks, and that's what we see. But we love people that do righteous things and good things, that kind of do something for somebody else, and then that person goes ahead and does something for someone else too. So God had to judge them as a result of this. So he judged them. He put them out of the garden. He put that cherubim that guarded the way to the tree of life and put them outside of the garden. And now Adam and Eve were involved in the death process. So remember what I said about death? There are three aspects to it. There's spiritual death. They were cut off from the source of their life, which was God. Then there's physical death. That's when the soul and the spirit leave the body and they just die, physically die. And the third one is eternal death. That's eternal separation from God forever and can never enjoy the benefits of knowing who God is like you could before. So, and then when they did, they disobeyed God. God judged them, put them out. And then they were outside of the garden, and they had children. First child was Cain. Second child was Abel. And then there came a day where they were offering sacrifices to God, and Cain brought vegetables from his garden. Abel brought an animal, a lamb to sacrifice. And it says, now, to Abel and his offering, God had respect. God respected that, both of them, Abel and his offering. But to Cain and his offering, he says God did not have respect. So he did not respect what Cain had done because he didn't come to God in the way God had prescribed. Now, it doesn't tell us at that particular point what God had prescribed, but what we see is throughout Scripture, we see that pattern. So something must have been said. Now, remember, back when Adam and Eve, when they first sinned, what's the first thing they did? They tried to sew fig leaves together and make clothing out of that. And what did God do? He didn't. He didn't allow that. And so what he did, he says he covered them with coats of skin. And so what he did is he killed an animal. This innocent animal died in the place of sinful man and women. And so a man and a woman. And so he covered them with coats of skin. There was a blood that was covering. The shedding of blood caused the animal to die. And then the skin was taken to make clothing for Adam and Eve. Well, in the same way with Cain and Abel, Cain needed to come to God on God's terms. Abel did that. But what Cain decided to do was to come to God on his own terms, and that's what he wouldn't accept. So as we go through that, then as time goes on, we come to the flood. For 120 years, Noah preached a message that God was going to send a flood. The people laughed. They didn't bother with him. They didn't listen to him, not even his relatives and so on. And then one day, of course, God brought the flood, and it destroyed the earth, destroyed everything on the earth. Everything that could breathe air was destroyed. And they floated on that ark for a year. Or I shouldn't say for a year. After a year, they got off of the ark. And then all the animals that were put on the ark were now let loose, and they could once again be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The man and the woman and the children and also the animals. And so the earth was repopulated once again. So that was Noah and that flood. And what we're getting from there is God means what he says. He isn't messing around. When he says he's going to do something, you can bet your boots he's going to do it. So then 100 years after that, the Tower of Babel came up. People were starting to spread out, and then all of a sudden they decided, hey, why don't we make a name for ourselves? Instead of moving off all over the place, let's all gather here in this one big city. We'll build a tower to ourselves so people can notice who we are. Then the people in Babel would be could stay there together and do all the stuff that they want to do, but that's not what God's first command was. It says, fill the earth. So they decided not to do that. God came down and he confused the languages, and then everybody went off in their own place, or God took them and put them in those places. It's not. It's kind of ambiguous what happened, how it exactly happened. We just know that it happened. And so people scattered all over the earth, and we see that. And then after that, we see God decides to involve himself with a particular person by the name of Abram. And Abram was told when he was in Ur of the Chaldees, says, leave your family, your friends, everything, your lands, your home country, and go to the land that I'm going to show you. Well, Abram started off with several of his family members going with him, which is not necessarily what God wanted him to do. And so God couldn't bless him in the same way until he got rid of all of his family. And finally, he left all of his family at one particular point, and then God told him, and he received a blessing. Through you, all families of the earth shall be blessed. And your descendants will be as the stars of the sky or as the sand of the sea. So Abram would have lots and lots and lots of descendants as a result of him believing God. And so that's what he did. But while he was there in that process, there was his nephew Lot had gone into live in a place called Sodom, in Sodom. And when he was there, the people there were very wicked, just like many towns are. But this one was really known for its wickedness. And so God said he was going to come down, he was going to destroy that place. And Abram talked with God and said, please don't. Would you destroy? He went from 50 down to 10. He says, would you destroy that city if there were 10 righteous people in there? And God says, no, I will not destroy it if there are 10 righteous people in there. He ends up destroying it, which tells us there were not 10 righteous people in that city. But Lot and his family, it ended up being Lot and his 2 daughters were the only ones that made it out of that place alive. His wife made it out for a ways, and then she turned back, which they were told not to do. She turned back, and whether she just looked at Sodom she was turned to salt, or whether that kind of is more of a meaning that she wanted to go back or was turning back to and going back to Sodom, and she was turned to salt. So in any event, that's what happened. And so Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, and many of those people in there, and it was just to show God doesn't mess around. When he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. And then as time goes on, Abram's name and Sarai's name are changed to Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham and Sarah have a son by the name of Isaac. And Isaac marries a woman by the name of Rebekah. And then Isaac and Rebekah have 2 children, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is the one through whom the line of the deliverer is coming through. And Jacob is kind of a shifty type of guy, but anyway, just to make a long story short, he goes to back to his family's home. There he marries, he wanted to marry a girl by the name of Rebecca. I'm sorry, not Rebecca, but Rachel. And so Rachel was his one, and he worked for 7 years for her, but his father-in-law kind of tricked him and had him marry Rachel's sister, Leah. And as a result of that, he had to work 7 more years for Rachel. And then both of their handmaids, neither one of them could have children for a while. And so each of the women says, here, take my handmaid and have a child through her, and then that'll be my child. And he did, had children through them. Then all of a sudden, both Rachel and Leah started bearing first, and then Rachel finally did towards the end, and had 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin. So, but before, when Jacob was coming back, and this is really important, when Jacob was coming back to Canaan, it says that he heard that his brother Esau was coming, and he was scared about that. So he sends his family ahead, and he gets ready for that whole deal. And then all of a sudden, right before he gets ready to cross this river, the river Jabbok, an angel comes and talks to him, and then the angel and Jacob started wrestling with each other, and they wrestled all night long. And the Jacob would not let go of this angel, because we know in the morning, right before the sun came up, the angel says to Jacob, he says, "Let me go, because the day is breaking." And Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And so he wanted that blessing. And so he got that blessing from the angel, who turns out to be the angel of the Lord, which is a reference to the Son of God, I believe. But it was God who spoke to him. And then it says he caused his joint in his hip, I think, to be out of joint, and he limped the rest of his life, and he had a cane that he walked with. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? How God, every step that he took the rest of his life, reminded him that had he let go of that angel, God was going to be done with him. But he didn't. So Jacob wrestled with the Lord. And then Jacob has 12 sons and one daughter of Dinah, and then he had these other sons, some through the handmaids of Rachel and Leah, and then some through Leah, and then some through Rachel. And so there's this, then it starts up with Joseph. Joseph is a son of Rachel and Jacob and Rachel. By the way, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. God said that to him after he wrestled with him. "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have wrestled with God and with man and have prevailed." So now Israel, or Jacob, has these sons, and these sons, one of the sons is the name of Joseph. Now, I don't know what kind of a kid he was growing up, but he was a favorite of his dad because he was the son of Rachel, and Rachel was his favorite wife. And so Joseph had these dreams. He had two dreams mainly. One about some stalks of sheaves that stood up, and there were 12 of them that stood up, and they bowed towards this, or 11 that stood up and bowed towards the one, which was Joseph. And then they had another dream about the 11 stars, and then the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars all bowing towards him. And so they really didn't take kindly to that thought. And so an incident came up where they actually took Joseph, threw him in a pit, and then sold him to Midianite traders. And these traders took Joseph to Egypt, and they sold him as a slave to a man by the name of Potiphar, he was a captain of the Pharaoh's guard. And he did such a good job at everything that he did that Potiphar put him in charge of his house. Eventually, there was nobody more powerful in that household than Jacob, except for Potiphar. And so he was doing fine. Everything was fine and dandy. But he was kind of like Henry Cavill, who plays Superman now. Man of Steel. He looked good. He was a nice-looking guy. He was well-built. He was just looked good. He kind of would turn women's heads when he went by. But it also turned the head of Potiphar's wife. And she kept trying to get him to sleep with her, and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. He says, "I cannot dishonor God, and I cannot dishonor my master, who is your husband." And so there came a situation where came up where she tried to push herself on him, and he ran away, and she grabbed the towel that was around him, or his whatever it is he wore, like a sarong type of thing, and he ran out of the house naked. And so she, in turn, called all the people in the house, "Look what this Hebrew slave did. He tried to molest me," and all this stuff. And when Potiphar came home, she told him the story. He got really upset, and he throws Joseph in prison. Now, once again, like I told you before, I don't think he was upset with Joseph. I think he was upset at his wife, because under Joseph, everything had done well, and he knew Joseph's character. He knew what Joseph was like, and he knew Joseph would never do this to him. So anyway, he goes into prison. But while he's in there, these two men come to him in the prison. There are prisoners. One's a baker, and one of them is a cupbearer for Pharaoh. And they both have a dream, and they tell Joseph this story. Joseph interprets the story, but he never admits that it's him doing it. He says, "God will reveal the dream to you." And he tells them, in 3 days, you're both going to be released from prison. But one of you is going to be hung. The other one, until you die, the other one is going to be restored to the place of honor that he was at before. And so that was what happened. So Joseph was doing this. And after 2 years of being in that prison, the Pharaoh had 2 dreams about something that was going to happen, and he didn't know what it meant. And none of his magicians or sorcerers or wise men could tell him what the deal was. And so he calls for Joseph. Joseph comes, tells him what's going to happen, and he tells him, he says, here's what you need to do. He says, you need to find a really wise man to manage all of this and take care of this, because there's going to be 7 years of good times, 7 years of hard times. And he says, store up while the good times are good, so that when you get to the hard times, you can survive and Egypt won't be destroyed. And so Pharaoh, because he hears this, he puts Joseph in charge. Not only in charge of doing all this, he puts him in second in command in Egypt. So nobody is more powerful than Joseph other than Pharaoh himself. And so that's an amazing thing. But during those 7 years of famine, the hard times, even people from other lands had to come to Egypt to buy food for them, because none of the other people had stored up like Joseph had. And so, but one of those groups of people that came was Jacob and his family. So first his brothers came. They didn't recognize him. Joseph kind of toyed with them for a while, to see what they were like, what their thinking was, whether they truly had repented of what they had done. And through some circumstances, he finally reveals himself to his brothers who he is. And it's just an amazing story of God's grace, and Joseph being an exhibition of that grace to other people who had wronged him. And so as a result of that, he says, go and tell my father and all your family, you come to Egypt and live with us so that you can survive. And so Jacob and his family, I think there were 70 of them, they all packed up and they all moved to Egypt and then lived in a little place called Goshen. And so that's where they were at. And that's how Genesis ends. So that's how the story goes. Now there are some common themes throughout all of this. We see God's omnipotence. God can do anything, and he does things at the right time for the right reason. Remember how we talked about how the plants needed water and air and light and dirt to exist and those were created first before the plants were created. And that's just an amazing story in and of itself. Well, in the same way, God is preparing for a deliverer that's going to come. That's the end product. And so in order to do that, there are things that are happening along the way. And so these are stories that talk about how God is omnipotent. There's nothing that can stop him. He is going to do it, but he will always do it in a way that's consistent with who he is. He's not going to violate your will just so he can win. He doesn't have to. What he does is he works around your choices in a way that he always comes out the winner anyway. That's the point. And so he's omniscient. He knows everything there is to know. Well, there's nothing he can learn. He knows it all. Everything else has to learn. It was created, therefore it is by nature finite. And so, but God isn't. God is everywhere at the same time, all the time. So he's everywhere. Like that girl said, God is so big that he doesn't have to go anywhere. But he's also present there all the time. Everywhere that he's at is the present to him. God, the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. God is an eternal being. He's always there. He exists in all places, all times, all the time. Pretty interesting thing, isn't it? That's what it means to be eternal. But also his eternality means that all of his attributes have no beginning or end to them. They are eternal. They have no boundaries to them, which is an amazing thing also. He's loving. He cared for Adam and Eve. He created this universe so that Adam and Eve could live and enjoy in it and just be blessed. Even today, we are still benefiting from God's creation. He's made this earth in such a way that we can continue to exist and live in it. He's loving. He's a provider. He provides everything that you need, but he provides the right things for you to need. He's faithful. He never doesn't do what he says he's going to do. He always does what he says he's going to do. He's orderly. He does things decently and in order. Like I said before with day 3, vegetation was of the last of those 3 days, but water, air, light, and dirt were there before. So he does things decently and in order. He builds. He builds upon a foundation. He finishes what he starts. He never lets anybody dissuade him, confuse him. He can't be confused or dissuaded. He doesn't get sidetracked. He doesn't do do-overs. He always does things right the first time. So whenever something comes into a person's life, at that moment, it's the right thing for that person at that moment. And because of different things that will take place, because of different decisions that people have made, but God has a decision that he makes too. God cannot be defeated. He is just. He'll do the right things all the time. He's holy. He is not like anything. Remember that statement I said way back in the beginning? God is in a category all his own. God's not like anything else. He is himself. Nothing that he created can affect him. He stays the same. He's always God and nothing else. All of God's attributes work all of the time to an infinite degree. It's an amazing thing. And there's so many more attributes that we could talk about, but there are things that we want to discuss, and as time goes on, we'll keep on with that. But for this lesson, I just wanted you to see how big and how wonderful and how tremendous God is. But it also reveals something about us too, doesn't it? That why the world is the way it is. It's because of what Adam did back in the beginning. When Adam sinned, it affected everybody. It affected everybody. Like I said, sin never affects just the person who did the sin. It affects everyone around them. And we're still suffering the consequences of that. The ground doesn't yield its strength anymore because of that. Thorns and thistles come up because of that event. So it affects everybody in every place, every culture. We're all affected by that. Sometimes the sun's too hot. Sometimes it's too cold outside. All of that is a result of that. So that being said, next week we're actually going to be starting on Exodus. Now, like I said before, we're not going to teach everything in the Old Testament, but we are going to teach the whole redemptive story. But for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about parts of Exodus. They're going through Exodus there, not the whole book, but a good portion of it, because once again, there's some things in there that need to be understood that help us to understand what God expects. Okay? So, if you have appreciated these podcasts, the video and the audio podcast, please let somebody know. Have them just get on, if it's an audio podcast, have them get on their favorite podcast app and just look up the Premature Bible Institute. If it's a video, if they want to watch it on YouTube like you are right here now, just have them get on YouTube and look up my name, Doug Schaible. Please have them subscribe to both of them. This way, whenever a new one comes up, it'll automatically come to their podcast app or YouTube app or YouTube notifications. So thank you guys again for all you've done. Appreciate you so much. Take care, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.